Hi, I'm Kaylee, and today I want to talk about some modern classics that have more of an old classics kind of feeling. Some of you probably know that I don't always have the best reading experience with modern classics. I define a modern classic as any book that was written after 1914, so anytime after the beginning of World War I. And I've talked before in other videos about how the public consciousness and the moral philosophy that was publicly accepted began to change after World War I, and literature began to change. You think of people like Hemingway and Faulkner, and they really changed how literature was accepted and thought of. And I just don't care for Hemingway and Faulkner and their style and their philosophy. And so a lot of the time, whenever I read books that are considered modern classics, I don't usually enjoy them. I prefer older classics because those books tend to line up more with my own moral philosophy and my own worldview, at least more closely anyway, than some of the more radical ideas in modern classics. So that is why I want to talk about some modern classics that I actually do love. These are books that were written, after 1914, or maybe sometimes like close around there, like 1910 or something, but that I would consider modern classics rather than, classics or ancient classics, like Plato and those guys. But these are ones that definitely line up more with my own worldview, and so they were ones that I could relate to more easily, and they're ones that I enjoyed. Before we get into those, I want to make sure that you know that Books for MKs is a charity that donates books to missionary kids. Today's MK shoutout goes to Ethan, who is 13 years old and lives with his family in Cambodia. He loves to read books about adventure. If you want to donate to Ethan and children like him, you can donate to the Books for MK's charity at GoFundMe.com. Please give this video a big thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little notification bell. One of the first modern classics that I want to talk about is probably pretty obvious. It's the Anne of Green Gables series by L.M. Montgomery. The Anne of Green Gables series was written between 1908 and 1921. And then another one of her series, Emily of New Moon, was written between 1921 and 1927. These are very wholesome, sweet stories, as all of L. Montgomery's books are. I really enjoyed these when I was a young person, and I still enjoy them, and I love rereading them. These definitely have an old classic feel because they deal with really deep universal themes that just apply to everyone, no matter what time period you live in. The next one is the Grandma's Attic series by Arletta Richardson. These books were written between 1974 and 1991, but they feel like The Little House on the Prairie. This is a story about a young girl who grows up in the country, and she has like a bucket pail that she takes to the one-room schoolhouse, and they go to the ice cream social and everything. It has a very Little House on the Prairie kind of feel, and that is why it's an old feeling, even though it's a modern classic. The next one is, of course, the actual Little House on the Prairie books by Laura Ingalls Wilder. These were written between 1932 and 1971, but they're set, much earlier in the late 1800s. So of course they have that old-timey feeling because they're set in, the Victorian kind of classical era. The next one is the Hornblower series by C.S. Forester. These are high seas adventures following a young man named Horatio Hornblower. These were written between 1937 and 1962, but they're set, I think, in the Regency era. So think like Jane Austen's time. And even just the writing style has this very old-timey classic kind of feel to it. The dialogue and everything feels like it really could have happened that way in that era. Next, I have two books by Daphne du Maurier, Rebecca and My Cousin Rachel. Rebecca was written in 1938 and My Cousin Rachel was written in 1951. My Cousin Rachel especially has a very old classic feel because it is set in a Victorian time period. Rebecca is set more in like the 1920s, 1930s, I think, era. but it's still, the way it is written has a very old classic kind of feel to it. It feels like it could have happened in any era. It doesn't feel modern, if that kind of makes sense. It feels like it's a story kind of outside of time. Both of these have, of course, amazing writing style and mystery and intrigue, and it really draws the reader in. The next one is The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, which was written in 1945, but again, it is set like in 1905, 1910, right around that turn of the century era. This is about a young widow who falls in love with a ghost. Again, it is written with universal themes and a very thoughtful narrative with very sensitive characters. So there's a lot of nuances and subtlety in the writing that just gives me kind of this old-timey feeling. Next, I have one of my favorites from when I was a kid, Esther Forbes' Johnny Tremain. This was written in 1945, but it is set during the American Revolution. And the way that it looks at this particular period in history, when this young nation is just beginning to find its own identity, separate from its parent nation, as we could say. It's just really interesting look at this time period, all wrapped up with the drama of these characters and then the political drama and, war drama that comes in as the revolution begins. Next, I have James Hilton's Goodbye, Mr. Chips. This was written in 1934, and I think it spans quite a long time period, I'd say from like 1895 all the way up to the First World War. So it's kind of like it starts in a Victorian time period and ends up more in a modern time period. The way that it's written and the philosophy behind, the teaching, because Mr. Chips is the teacher, and so his philosophy behind, what does education mean to our nation and things like that. It's a very old-fashioned way of looking at education, which I really appreciated and really thought was very interesting. Then I have C.S. Lewis's Pilgrim's Regress. This was written in 1933, but of course it's written in the style of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. So that's quite a sort of antiquated language that it uses. I would really recommend first reading Pilgrim's Progress and immediately start reading Pilgrim's Regress, because the two books really, feed off of each other so much. And it's just so interesting to see C.S. Lewis's kind of perspective on that old classic and the way that he mimics that old style. Then I have G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown. I feel like I'm talking about Father Brown a lot lately, but it's definitely a favorite. The Father Brown series was written between 1911 all the way up to 1935. It's definitely written in kind of the style of Sherlock Holmes, sort of almost like a weird kind of parody of Sherlock Holmes, maybe. The mysteries that Father Brown solves has that same kind of Sherlock Holmes mystery type of feeling, but Father Brown himself as a character is, of course, quite different from Sherlock Holmes, obviously. So the setting and the plot is very reminiscent of that old classic Sherlock Holmes. But then the characters and I would say the writing style are quite different. It's really interesting to see the way that Chesterton kind of builds on that Sherlock Holmes trope and that style of mystery. Next, I have a book by Charles Hawes called The Dark Frigate. This was written in 1923, but again, it is set either in the early Victorian or maybe the late Regency era. And it's a high seas adventure where they're on these wonderful old sailing ships and they run across pirates and hurricanes and all kinds of wonderful adventures. And despite it being written in 1923, it really has that same kind of old style, writing style. It feels like a Victorian novel. The next one is, I wasn't really sure whether to include it in this list, but I think I'm going to include it. It's Tarzan by Edgar Rice Burroughs. The Tarzan books were written between 1912 all the way up to 1941. There are a lot of Tarzan books. I want to say there's something like 18 Tarzan books. I mean, there's a lot of them. I'm not really sure what it is that the writing style or the plot or what it is quite in the Tarzan books that reminds me of that old-timey feel of an old-timey classic. I I really can't put my finger on it because the writing style isn't really that old-fashioned. And the characters do have like this high sense of morality that you would see in Victorian era characters. All the women in the Tarzan series, at least so far that I've read, are all like beautiful angels, you know, who can never do any wrong, which is kind of typical of like a Dickens heroine that would just be this angelic creature, you know. So maybe that's it. Maybe some of the characterization reminds me of Victorian characters, but the plots and the writing aren't particularly old-fashioned or anything. So yeah, just something about those books makes me feel like I'm reading a classic. Next, I have the 39 Steps Richard Hannay series by John Buchan. This series was written between 1915 up to 1936. This is spy stories and intrigue and, you know, political machinations and just wonderful action adventure. Again, we have very heroic heroes who struggle against the darkness, you know, and very angelic women who are sort of this inspiration to the men. And there's a certain kind of richness to the writing style. It's not necessarily, you know, antiquated or old-fashioned, but there's a very rich writing style that just draws the reader in and makes me think of classic style writing. Another book by John Buchan is The Blanket of the Dark. This is set in the days of Cromwell, so it's sort of a historical novel that has certain historical characters like Cromwell. The writing style in this one is very different from the 39 Steps. The 39 Steps has a much more modern writing style, but The Blanket of the Dark has a very antiquated, very old-fashioned kind of writing style because it's trying to capture, you know, the culture and the language of those olden days back when Cromwell was running around. This book very strongly reminds me of Sir Walter Scott. The characterization, the plot, the writing style, all of it. I mean, I read it and I feel like I'm reading Sir Walter Scott. I don't know if the author did that on purpose, like to try to mimic that style, but he does it very well. And it's really interesting. And I need to reread that one. That's a good one. Next, I have pretty much anything written by Tolkien. Tolkien was a student of these old classic styles, you know, and so much of that bleeds through into his writing. Of course, The Lord of the Rings has a lot of that style, but then it'll sort of have a simpler narrative, and then it'll go into this high epic style, and then it'll go back a little more to the simpler storytelling. But a lot of Tolkien's other books, they have that antiquated writing style, very flowery and very rich language, and really mimicking very old ancient styles of writing. Smith of Wootton Major is one of his short stories that is told in this classic fairy tale style. The Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun, I'm sure I'm saying that really wrong. But that one, of course, is in this very ancient language style. And I think The Fall of Arthur is like that too. All of it feels very old. You know, you get this sense of antiquity when you read his works. William Horwood wrote The Tales of the Willows, which are 4 sequels to Kenneth Grahame's Wind in the Willows. And usually I do not like it when other authors try to pick up some other author's work and try to mimic their style, but William Horwood does it so perfectly. I mean, I could have sworn that Kenneth Grahame wrote those books because his writing style and the way that he would weave stories and characters is just so perfectly imitated. These books were written between 1993 and 1999, and they feel like classics. They feel like Kenneth Grahame. The next one is The Girl of the Limberlost, or pretty much any book written by Gene Stratton Porter. I can't remember the year that Girl of the Limberlost was written. I want to say it's like the 1940s sometime, maybe? I'm not really sure. Girl of the Limberlost has a similar style to like Anne of Green Gables, sort of. So it has that kind of wholesome, sweet storyline and very easy to follow, but quite deep writing style. And the last one I have to talk about is the Wreckers trilogy by Ian Lawrence. These are 3 high seas adventures books that were written between 1998 and 2001. These feel, again, like old high seas adventures and these, beautiful sailing ships and pirates and adventures and all kind of stuff. But it feels like it's a Victorian novel. They're actually quite short, and I think you could consider them YA, but the style of the narrative and the way that the characters speak and everything really reminds me of a Victorian novel. And those are the books that are modern classics, or at least I would consider them modern classics, but they have an old classics kind of feel. Please leave me a comment down below and let me know what are some modern classics that you think have a very old-fashioned style. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and remember, the right book in the right hands at the right time can change the world.